The Ripper Case by Alex Loudin. Let me introduce myself. My name is Jack, Dr. Jack Batchumber. I work as a medical surgeon for both the mentally sound and unsound. More often than not, I would be working on the mentally ill and some who are badly hurt. Now enough with my rambling and on to where this story begins and why I'm in the situation that I'm in. This is a story of how I was accused of being Jack the Ripper. They pointed the finger at me because I am a genius and for the fact that I'm a surgeon. So I was a prime suspect because who would think twice about suspecting a surgeon to make these horrific attacks? So I decided to help them find the man responsible for everything. I was put in a small empty room that was dimly lit with 2 chairs and a medium-sized table for questioning. 2 officers came in shortly after, and one of the officers was a tall, gauntly, clean-cut-looking man, while the other was a short, rounded man with mutton chops with an English moustache.
"Hello, sir. How are you doing today?" the short one asked in the most sincere and wholesome tone of voice. "I'm doing well, just a bit on the queasy side on why I'm here," I replied with a timid tone. "Oh, there's no need to worry, sir. We are only going to ask you a few questions and then you can go home and be on your merrily way. Sound good?" He spoke in a soothing tone to ease my nerves. "Okay, I'll answer to the best of my abilities," I reassured him. The other officer, however, just rolled his eyes in disbelief, as if he knew that I was the killer and was just nervous about the fact that I had been caught. All right. Enough with this niceness charade, and let's just get to the questions, shall we? As you may know, there have been 5 known murders, maybe even more, that are unbeknownst to us. So the question at hand is, you wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Doctor? The tall officer commanded an answer, or even a confession. "No, but I've heard about them before, but I don't know anything further than that," I replied with false confidence, to hide the fact that he had scared me with his questioning assumption that I would possibly know or could have done the things that he had mentioned. The gaunt-looking officer just scowled at me in disbelief, as if I had just lied right in front of him. "Listen here. We know that the killer had to have great skills in cutting his victims the way he did. He was also able to remove the bodily organs with ease and—" he continued to say, but unfortunately I had to stop him before he went too far with his words. Excuse me, sir." I paused to try and stop myself from making a sound and to possibly prevent myself from getting sick. "If I may ask, could you please stop before I become sick?" I asked, covering my mouth and trying to fight off my queasiness and not get sick in front of the officers. He looked at me with an irritated glare, as if I had insulted him in some way. "But aren't you a surgeon, sir? Shouldn't you be used to the fact that I would be describing what you would see on an operation table?" He spoke with an arrogant smile, as if he had caught me in a lie and that I was a usual suspect. "Believe me when I say this, I know that it seems rather odd, but what you are talking about is mutilation and not surgery. I'm a doctor, not a murderer," I replied to the officer, and he was caught off guard by my statement. Then the short officer spoke. "While he is a surgeon, there are differences between the 2 fields. For example, one is a profession while the other is a horrendous crime." He spoke genuinely as he had vouched for me. The tall one angrily glared at his partner and began to become angrier as he thought I was insane. This had gone on for hours until we all had heard a cry for help, followed shortly after by a shriek of terror. The tall, angry officer looked furiously while his shorter partner looked horrified. They brought me along because the angry officer didn't trust me to be alone and cuffed me while we went in the direction of the cry by carriage, as I was put in the back where criminals go. We arrived at the scene of the crime. Both officers left me in the police carriage to prevent me from escaping, as I had committed the crime. Moments go by, and other officers crowd in the crime scene and talk amongst themselves to try and come up with reasoning as to why and how the crime was committed. I glanced over to see that some of the officers and detectives couldn't bear to witness the sight of what they were looking at. The short, jolly officer made his way to the carriage. He had a look that was very apologetic, as if he were to ask me to do something that I hated. "Sir," he started and paused to collect his words, "I know that these types of things may very well be horrifying to you, but could you possibly please come and look at the bodies so that we would know what we're looking for, or that we are looking at the same guy?" He finished scarcely with a regretful tone. I looked at him with a smile and spoke. "Well, I'll try to take a look. Anything to help, I'll gladly oblige." I responded, reassuring him that I was with him. He then took me out of the carriage carefully, as if to not hurt me. He even led me to the crime scene, but treated me as a normal person and not a criminal like the other officer would have. I smelled the stench of death and decay in the air, as if some of the bodies were there for a long period. The other officers just stood around covering their noses to keep out the smell of rotting flesh, and some had to wait outside of the room where the recent victim was at. The small officer turned and looked horrified and spoke. "Now I'm warning you. In that room, it is very gruesome." He spoke to me in a comforting voice even though he was terrified of what was found. He then uncuffed me so that I was able to examine the corpse closely and how the wounds were made on the body. I had told him to wait outside as I went into the room and to spare him from seeing the body more than he needed. The tall officer glared at me with an angry look as he saw me enter the room. "What are you doing here? You should be in the carriage where you belong." The tall officer commanded an answer. I looked at him with a stern look as he glared, snarling at me. "I just came to help out with the problem. I am a surgeon after all, isn't that why you brought me along?" I responded, and noticed that he hated the answer I provided, and turned to walk back to the spot he came from. I then examined the body as he continued to give me a hateful glare. I had never seen such a horrendous sight before in my life. The lacerations were careless, as if the killer hadn't cared about how he killed or who he killed as long as his prey was dead. He'd have been happy, however. There were careful cuts as if to remove certain bodily organs. As I looked at the victim's lifeless body, I began to feel myself getting sick. I immediately got up and walked away from the body and covered my mouth to stop myself from becoming sick and ruining what we may have gotten from the poor woman. The tall officer then growled at me. "Well, so what all was it then, huh?" He spoke in an angered tone. I tried to clear my head and collect my thoughts and tried not to think about the horrendous sight of the victim. "Well," I began scarcely. "She was butchered, and some of her organs are gone," I responded with a frightened tone in my voice. I was horrified by the macabre of how someone could do this sort of thing, and worse to even think about doing it as well. The tall officer looked smug and had a smirk as if he had caught something that I was unaware of. "So," he began and paused for effect. "A surgeon. Did all of this then, huh? Very suspicious, wouldn't you say, Dr. Batchumber, the renowned surgeon?" He spoke in a mocking tone as he was accusing me of the mutilation of the victim.
"I said that she was butchered. That was, or is in this case, the cause of death and not the careful removal of her organs, officer. A person can still live if you remove one of their organs the right way, but not by being butchered beforehand." I paused to collect myself to not be angered by his false accusations. "So more than likely we are looking for a butcher who got bored of butchering the animals he serves at his shop, and does unto the people like his new prey for an undesired want by his unsound mind." I finished my response to the tall irate officer. His response was to walk off angrier than he was before. I in return walked to the entrance to find the smaller officer so he could take me back to the carriage. As I got closer to him I saw that he was sitting on the steps near the entrance of the building, and noticed that he was looking at a photograph of a woman. I sat right next to him and spoke. "Who might the lovely lady be?" "Your daughter, perhaps." I spoke to him to try and start up a conversation to try and make his mind at ease from the scene of the crime. He smiled and proudly said, "No, she's my wife. Looks like an angel, huh?" He spoke, still looking at the picture in his hands. "Yes, you're a lucky man and seems as if she is a lucky lady to have a good man such as yourself." I responded with a smile to lighten things up. He smiles bigger and from ear to ear as he pats me on the back and knowing the fact that he had made a new friend. "So what is her name and yours, if you don't mind me asking?" I asked to further our conversation to put his mind at ease more. "Her name is Rebecca, and I'm Officer Petter." He gleefully spoke. I straightened my tie and introduced myself. "I'm Dr. Jack Batchumber." I spoke confidently. No relation to the other Jack." I finished jokingly, and as he chuckled I asked, "So what's Mr. Sunshine and Rainbow's name?" "Edward. His name is Officer Edward," Petter responded with a smile. "Now I know their names." And at that moment Officer Edward came out and grabbed me by my collar to pull me aside jerkingly to question me further. As he threw me against the wall, he glared with a rage-filled look and spoke hatefully. "Just how did you know that she was butchered right away, huh?" He spoke harshly. "You got something to do with this, don't you, Dr. Batchumber?" he asked demandingly. I looked him in the eyes as I spoke. "I'm a surgeon by trade." I started. "I should know a bad job of cutting when I see one, shouldn't I?" I responded with the same tone as he had used. He didn't like my response and held me as he hit me in the gut with his police bat. Petter saw what had happened and jumped in to break up the fight that had ensued. "He just answered your question, Edward. Just the way you asked him to." Petter spoke as he confronted his partner to defuse the situation. Edward looked puzzled as Petter spoke up. "Well, he didn't have to sound like a wiseacre to me doing so." He spoke harshly. Petter looked crossly at Edward. "Well, maybe if you weren't accusing him of stuff that he didn't do, and trying to make him look bad, maybe you'd get some respect." He spoke with a pause to calm himself so he wouldn't say something that he'd regret. "You need to show respect to him to get respect." Petter stood up to Edward for me. Officer Edward looked even more enraged and walked back to the carriage because he knew that he was in the wrong. "Don't think too low of him." Petter stated to me, "He's just angry that we haven't caught Jack the Ripper yet, even though that still doesn't give him the right to do that." Petter tried to apologize for his partner's actions. I knew that I had to say something to keep Petter at ease, and to not show that I was angry, and to reassure him that I didn't think too lowly of his partner. "I forgave him already," or "I understand what he's going through," or something along those lines. I understand that he must be feeling stressed over the killer still being at large, so I wouldn't hold a grudge over him for his actions. I finally responded to Petter with a genuine look. He began to look relieved as he heard me say the things I had told him. We then got back in the carriage and headed back to the jailhouse because there were no leads left to follow up on. It was as if the man wanted us to know that it was him all along, but for some godforsaken reason, he didn't want us to know where he was. Oddly enough, it's either or, but in this case, it's both. As we made it back, I headed back to the questioning room that I was put in because I assumed that there was more questioning to be had. Petter then came and got me so that I could help out with figuring out who it could be. As Petter and I made our way to another room where we would be discussing our plan of action, Edward began to speak as we sat down. As I was told, we have 7 suspects. One's a butcher, one's a surgeon, a prostitute, a jealous friend, family member, neighbour, or a rogue pimp. Edward told the group sternly. Petter looked puzzled at the list Edward spoke of. Why would we need to investigate a pimp? Was she a streetwalker? He spoke in a hushed tone as if he had talked in a vulgar way and so the others wouldn't hear him. Yes, she was a famous one at that, so she'll have to have had enemies in her field of work. Edward responded. I spoke up. Okay, so are we going to each one individually or all together? Edward looked cross at me as if to wonder why I even came and responded with, We'll call them in and interrogate them that way so we'd have an upper hand. Petter spoke, pondering his idea. Why don't we just go and talk to each one instead of asking them to come here? Because wouldn't we be able to catch them in a lie at their place of work? Or if there is more than one, they could tip the other off to form a plan of action of their own without our knowing? Petter asked Edward. I looked surprised as to how he was able to come up with a great plan like that. Edward then second-guessed himself and went with Petter's idea because it was better sounding and made more sense to catch them off guard and catch them before they could pull a fast one on us. I then pondered the thought of what if they tried to escape. They'd know exactly where to go. So I pulled Petter aside and asked privately, and he responded with, Not to worry. The buildings will be surrounded and they'll have no way out without an officer knowing it first.
I then figured out why Edward is so furious all the time. It is because Petter is a better police officer. So do we just go and question the rest of the suspects after we're done with one, or do we wait? I wondered, and asked Petter. He smiled and replied, Oh, we will, but first let us call it a day and get some supper, shall we? My wife cooks a lot of delicious food for my daughter, her and myself. How about you join us? Petter asked me as he smiled and genuinely meant what he said. It caught me by surprise. One moment he and Edward were asking me questions about that dreaded Jack the Ripper monster, and now I've made a friend who has invited me to dinner. I paused to collect my words to not sound nervous. Don't know, Officer Petter, I don't want to intrude. I responded politely. He just smiled to reassure me that I wasn't going to be an intrusion at all. Oh no, you wouldn't be intruding at all, Doctor. Plus, she always makes thirds and you'll have plenty to eat. He responded with a pat on my back and a warm gesture of kindness. I smiled back. Well, okay then. You have persuaded me to join you, my friend. I responded with a joking tone. He smiled with a chuckle, and then we made it to his home. It was an interesting walk because he had told me all that he and his partner have been through, their ups and downs. Petter had shown me a picture that he got with Edward when they were first recruited. I never knew that Edward could smile, and to be honest, I never would have believed it until he showed me a picture. I had then asked what had happened to make him bitter. Petter just looked at me and smiled. Well, he started. There was a case that had to be solved and he was the only one that was available at the time. Petter paused for a moment. My daughter was born that day and I had to be by her side. He insisted that I go and be with her in the hospital and that he'd take the rookie to break him in. He looked down and nearly teared up, but he continued to explain. I was very appreciative about it and went to the hospital as fast as I could run. He paused and made a joke. I used to be a lot thinner back then, but now I let my wife bake and here I am now, ha. He spoke jolly-like. He then explained what else happened and I was shocked by his words. They made it to a murder scene, and it was something out of a horror story. Edward had become scared for his life for the first time. The rookie heard a noise and decided to go and investigate it further. Edward was too frightened and wanted to get back up, but the rookie said that the guy would be long gone before they got back, and then he heard a gunshot followed by the rookie's screams. Petter stopped to catch his breath for a moment. I spoke. "It's okay if you can't tell me. I'll understand." I told him so that he didn't have to relive a terrifying memory, and he looked at me and said, No, it's fine, I'll tell you so that you'll understand where he's coming from, and that he doesn't mean all of what he says and for acting in a hateful manner. He replied and continued his story. Edward had to follow the muffled screams of the rookie as he was being stabbed to death. He then found them and saw something horrifying and took aim, then shot the perpetrator. He wasn't the same after that. We had gotten reports of what had happened, and the other officers found him on his knees covered in blood. He didn't speak and lost his smile. I never knew the rookie's name, and it's a very touchy subject for him to talk about. So I just try to make his days better by being the nice copper and letting him know that everyone isn't all that bad. He stopped, and I had to let all that sink in. So much has happened. Before I knew it, we were at his home. His home was beautiful, and interestingly, it was in a place that was surrounded by poverty. We then walked up to his door, and as he got to it, the door swung open, and there to greet him was his daughter with the same love and joy that is in her father's eyes. She had a smile that was from ear to ear, and she looked genuinely happy and not sad at all. He kneeled, and she ran into his arms and kissed him on his cheek as if he had been gone for far too long. I then saw a woman in the hallway, whipping her hands with a cloth that had seemed worn, and she too had a great big smile. I looked in awe that there could be a family like this in such a run-down place, and not to mention be happy. After his daughter was done hugging her father, his wife came to give him the same greeting as she wholesomely kissed him as if it were their first time. She then led him into their living room so he could be warmed up with their love from the cold, cruel world that we had come from. I just stood in the doorway admiring the way that everyone acted towards each other, and wishing to myself that I wanted that as well. I imagined myself having a wife and 2 kids as I saw how happy Petter and his family are. I then broke out of that trance as his lovely wife spoke. "Oh well, who might this be, dear?" she asked in a soft, caring voice. He smiled and looked at me, gesturing me to come in and stay a while. "Oh yes, that's Dr. Batchumber. He's a friend of mine from work." He introduced me as I walked into his home holding my hat in one hand and holding out the other to shake her hand. "I'm Jack Batchumber. How are you lovely ladies doing this fine evening?" I introduced myself with a greeting and tried to sound as gentlemanly as possible. Petter just grinned ear to ear, and his daughter held onto her father's arm as she giggled at what I had said, and his wife Rebecca bowed and spoke. "Oh, why, thank you, kind sir," she said as she began to shake my hand, and then their daughter introduced herself. "Hi, I'm Alexandria Ann." She spoke excitedly and bubbly. I got down on my knee and said, "What a lovely name, little miss." I replied as I kissed her hand. She then giggled and went to her mother's side and was a little embarrassed, and as I stood up smiling and thinking to myself that they were truly a happy family. They all shared a big smile, and I was just wondering how they could be a happy few, even though the world wasn't such a happy place. Rebecca looked at me and asked, "Will you be staying with us for supper? We have room for another plate." Rebecca tried to persuade me to stay. I responded with, "I appreciate the offer, but Petter here already talked me into it." I finished and her happy smile grew bigger. She looked over at her daughter and spoke, "Honey, help me get the table ready." Rebecca told her daughter, "Okay, Mummy." Alexandria Ann responded. I looked around the place and I was astonished at how lovely it was. Petter then began to talk to me. "You know, you just made her weak, right?" He spoke to me genuinely. "Really? How's that?" I asked him. He smiled and spoke. "Because she does so loves to cook for people. She's a baker, you know." Petter spoke proudly of his wife. I thought that was fascinating and responded, "Well then I bet you get a lot of the best sweets since she's a baker then, huh?" I responded with a smile. His eyes lit up. "Oh yes, ha ha ha," he responded excitedly. "She's the best. As a matter of fact, she's better than a ton of the other bakers in the world." He finished with a huge grin, admiring his wife from the living room as she got dinner set up in the dining room. As the smell of delicious food came to my nose, I began to feel excited to taste the food that she had prepared for us all. And maybe if I'm lucky, I'll get some desserts. Petter saw me thinking of food and sweets and smiled as he led me to the dining room kitchen to sit at the table so we all could eat together. As everyone began to take their seat at the table, I stood there hesitating to take a seat. I waited a bit to figure out where to sit. The table was set so beautifully and the food looked too good to eat. "So, Mr. Batchumber, what is it that you do for a living?" she asked. "If you don't mind me asking, that is." Rebecca finished. I swallowed the food that was in my mouth so that I wouldn't be rude. "Oh no, not at all." I cleared my throat and said, "I'm a surgeon. I help people get better faster." I responded as I saw that Alexandria Ann was surprised when I said that I was a surgeon. "A doctor?" Alexandria Ann asked, surprised. "Yes, that's right." I responded. She smiled a big smile and began to say, "I want to be a doctor someday too." She spoke excitedly, and I saw her parents smile. Peta began to speak. "Yes, that's all she talks about. She wants to heal people and make them better than when they come into the hospital." Peta spoke proudly of his daughter. "How good are you, Mr. Dr. Batchumber?" Alexandria Ann asked with her eyes full of curiosity. "I'd say probably one of, if not the best where I work," I responded. She looked down to collect her words and courage to ask me a question. "Do you think I'll be as good as you one day?" she asked confidently. I looked her in the eyes and spoke, "In my honest opinion." I paused to look as if I were thinking, "No." Both she and her parents looked surprised. Then I said, "I think you'll be better than I ever will be." I finished and saw that she grew a smile that was so infectious that it made everyone and could make anyone smile with her.
We all began to have seconds and talk about the day that we've all had. We all began to laugh together and tell funny stories to each other. As the night went on, we finished the feast that Rebecca had made for us. Rebecca and her daughter Alexandria Ann began to clean up the table. Alexandria went to clean the dishes and Rebecca began to clear the table. I offered to help clean the room, but Rebecca assured me that it wasn't necessary and thanked me for the kind gesture. I made my way to the living room after I thanked Rebecca for the lovely meal that she so kindly had me a part of, and everyone is so happy. I saw Peta and went up to him to talk. "Hey Peta, can I ask you something?" I asked him nervously and privately. "Yeah, of course. Why, is there something wrong?" He asked in response. I looked him in the eyes. "No, nothing's wrong. I'd like to, I paused as I tried to collect my words. "I was wondering why you three are so happy, even though life isn't all sunshine and colorful." I asked him sheepishly. He looks at me and smiles as he puts a hand on my shoulder. "Well, just because something lacks color or is dull, you just gotta add color to it." He told me to ease my thoughts. If you find yourself in a dark room, you just gotta add sunshine to it, and not only will you brighten your way, you'll just brighten the way of others as well. Peta finished with heartfelt reasoning, and I was moved by his words. Peta then offered for me to stay the night, and I had to decline because I had something to do at my home. He then offered to escort me home, but I told him I'd rather him stay at home because it'd make me feel better knowing that the family was safe. They all wished me a farewell and a safe passage home. I nodded and thanked them as well as wished them a farewell and a good night. As I began to walk further away from his home, in the night the darkness began to grow bigger and bigger as there was little to no light. I began to feel scared and helpless. I felt a monstrous shadow follow me. I looked back to see if I was right. To my surprise, I saw a lurking shadow just standing in an alleyway waiting for me to make a move. I began to walk faster as if I had never seen the shadow before. I felt as if it were following close behind me. I felt a shadowy hand on me getting closer to my throat as bad thoughts began to wrap around my mind. I thought for a moment that I was going to die and be the next victim.